What's up, my family? It's a bit of a different Sunday for some of you because we're showing this video at our in-person gathering at the Green as well as on our Zoom gathering at 8:30. The reason for that is, I believe you probably have heard, I'm over in Troy celebrating today. That it is celebrating the ministry of Ed Marcel. It's his last Sunday at Terra Nova Church in Troy as their lead pastor. And he is a mentor of mine, a dear friend of mine, and so I'm over there celebrating with them today. Sad I can't be with you all, but I'm glad I can be over in Troy with our family there. We're going to keep going in Matthew. We're going to keep looking at the person of Peter in the Matthew story and allowing his journey of following Jesus to help set expectations for what our discipleship journey of following Jesus is going to look like and will include on our path and on our journey. And today, we're going to get some topics that Jesus wants Peter and us as well to expect, even to embrace on our journey of following him. And these are topics and ideas that we want to, in our natural self, we want to dismiss, we want to avoid. It's the stuff that we just read in Matthew 16 of self-denial, suffering, loss, taking up a cross, death. Like, we don't see how those ideas dovetail with a thriving life, with an abundant life, with joy, with love. But Jesus sees them all. The suffering, the denial, the death. He sees them all as a pathway to life, to joy, to hope, not contradictions to them. Honestly, we could spend a lifetime learning from and living out these verses, and I guarantee you I'm going to get to the end of this video listening to it with you and Sunday afternoon and Monday and wish I would have said so much of this differently. There's just a ton of stuff in here for us to unpack. Let me start with this. It's a big idea to kind of frame up and hang the rest of this time on. It's the big idea I think Jesus lays out in this passage. And this may mess with you. This may overwhelm you. This may shock you. Like Peter, you may want to say, no, there's a different way. But here's the big idea. Suffering precedes joy. Death precedes life. Suffering precedes joy, and death precedes life. Naturally, for us, joy is the void of suffering, and life is the opposite of death. So, we, like Peter, are likely going to have to wrestle with these ideas that Jesus calls us into as disciples. Peter wrestled with this in this passage. Peter wrestled with this, but Peter then got to a place where he rested in these things. You read 1st and 2nd Peter, old, mature, later in life Peter, and these ideas drip as the main themes in 1st and 2nd Peter. My hope for us is that we too can wrestle with these things, and we're going to wrestle with them. We're not going to be able to fully come to a place of rest with these ideas in a short teaching and discussion, but with time, with life, with community, with the Word of God. May we too come to rest in the idea that suffering precedes joy and death precedes life. And the pathway on that, to that, is deny yourself, lose your life, take up your cross, and follow Jesus. We're going to chop that up in just a moment, asking the same 3 questions that we've been asking of these passages in Matthew since the beginning of January. What is revealed in these passages that help us love Jesus more? Because if we love him and fix our eyes on him, that's going to help an incredible amount for us to follow him. So what's in here that is revealed that helps us love him more? What is in here that helps us respond with more faith to follow him, to trust him? And then what's in here that can help us reflect these things as Jesus's missionaries? Because every disciple made is a missionary sent in the kingdom of Jesus. Before I get into that, I need to give 2 disclaimers, so bear with me for a few more minutes. First, suffering is a broad, massive topic that we all are going to come to have to deal with in our life. But when I use the word suffering today and I say things like suffering precedes joy, I want to say this. I am speaking of a very specific type of suffering. The suffering I'm going to be honing in on today is the suffering that we endure, we accept, we embrace, we are good with for the sake of someone else. Like, consider the pain, the suffering a kidney donor would say yes to so that somebody else can have a kidney and therefore have life. That's the category of suffering I'm using today. That's how I'm using that word. I'm not using the word suffering, the suffering that we may experience because someone else oppressively imposes their sin upon us. This is not a teaching talking about that kind of suffering. This should not be anything. I hope this is not used in any way to encourage you to grind it out and to hide that kind of suffering. No, that's an injustice that we need to fight against, that kind of suffering. I'm not talking about the suffering that just happens because we're part of a fallen world and part of that existence, like my college friend who just this week lost their 6-year-old son in a freak drowning accident. Stuff like cancer, like illnesses, like no, that's real suffering. And it's part of the life that we live in a fallen yet not redeemed world. Like, we'll have other sermons to walk through and journey those kinds of suffering. But this sermon is honing in on the suffering that we willingly embrace, accept for the good of others. This sermon is a call to be spiritual kidney donors, to say yes to less in our life, self-denial, pain, like to lose those things for the sake of someone else's life, their goodness, their spiritual health. That's what I'm honing in on today. I hope that disclaimer is helpful. To get after that, my focus is going to be, this is the second disclaimer, to get after that, my focus is going to be on verses 24 through 26 and Jesus's invitation here to deny yourself, take up your cross, and lose your life. Verse 27 and 28, certainly worth discussion. You probably have questions in there that I don't think are without answers, but it's not the focus for today. This honing in on this thing, suffering for the good of others, being a spiritual kidney donor, if you would, is our focus. But let me stop with the caveats, disclaimers, and get on into the sermon. Let's start where I think it's always super helpful for us to start. Let's look at the person of Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, the author and perfecter of our discipleship journey. It takes a lot of trust, a lot of love, if you would, to follow someone into pain, into less, into denial of yourself, death to yourself, because they say, like Jesus says here and in other parts of the Bible, trust me, there's more joy on the other side of your pain. There's a meaningful life on the other side of death. It takes a lot of love and trust to follow somebody into those thinkings and have it actually play out in your life. So 2 things that I want us to see that can deepen our love for Jesus so that we can build our trust for him more and be more willing to say, okay, Jesus, I trust you. I'm going to follow you in this. All right, so 2 things I want us to see. Guarantor and shepherd are the two words to frame this up. Let me try to be somewhat to the point on this first one of guarantor. And here's what I'm getting after. Jesus' resurrection from the dead guarantees the main idea of this sermon has merit. Right? Guarantees that this big idea is legitimate. Suffering precedes joy. Death precedes life. This is not just wishful thinking. This is not an opiate for those in the midst of trials. Jesus' resurrection guarantees that is the truth. Because If on the other side of his suffering, his pain, his self-denial, his journey to the cross, his death, if on the other side of all of those things, if all we are left with is dead Jesus, if he remained dead after his suffering and his death, all of that would be in vain, meaningless, pointless. It would be a failed play in God's playbook of redemption. It would be a foolish idea from a rogue teacher if he remained dead. This idea, suffering precedes joy and death precedes life. Nobody would listen to that. Nobody would believe it or promote it as a truth. But he's not dead. Right? This is where the resurrection of Jesus is a massive point of truth for us to believe in faith, because it guarantees that Jesus was right. On the other side of suffering is joy. On the other side of death is life. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. He died, and then the Father restored him to life. Jesus' death and his eternal life guarantee us that this is not just wishful thinking, but it's transformative and eternal truth. Suffering precedes joy. Death precedes life. Guarantor. Shepherd. Jesus guarantees it, but living it out is a whole nother journey. It's so hard. So Jesus doesn't just stand at a distance and guarantee something and say something and proclaim something. He's also our shepherd for this journey. Our God didn't just remain distant and watch his people suffer, endure pain for the sake of other people. He didn't wait until we had heard enough. Our God joins us in this incredibly difficult call to be willing to take less, to suffer more for the sake of others. Our God doesn't ask us to do something that he already hasn't done. He leads us in this path of life, which is the path of life that is best for us, though maybe not the easiest for us. He doesn't leave us to figure that out or to walk alone. Our God joins us, leads us, walks right there alongside of us as we say yes to the sake of suffering, for the sake of others, less for ourselves, more for others. And on this journey, we must train our eyes and train our hearts to see him as our shepherd right there, walking alongside of us. Not the stuff that we're saying no to. Get our eyes off of that. Get our eyes on Jesus. Love him more. Right? We have a great God who guarantees the outcome, and we have a good God who walks through the valley of death with us. That's what's in this passage and in the life of Jesus that can help him love him more, so that we can trust him and follow him. Because when we hear his voice speaking to Peter and calling to us, anyone, he says anyone in Matthew who wants to follow him as his disciple, know this, expect this. Deny yourself. Lose yourself. Die to yourself. He asks a rhetorical question. What is it that you gain? If you get everything, if you have everything you want, you desire, you wish for, but in that process you lose your soul and miss your Savior, what do you gain? Nothing. At the end of the day, you gain nothing. We know the answer to that rhetorical question. But even in knowing the answer to that, we can acknowledge that doesn't make the road that Jesus is calling us into and down any easier. Maybe he guarantees an outcome, something over there. But the pathway that he's calling us to is so hard, cuts so deep, takes too much from what we feel like we should get and have and deserve. And so though he may be calling us to something he's guaranteed, like I'm just gonna, like, that journey from here to there feels so daunting. I'm just gonna remain here with the little joys that I have, with the comfort that I enjoy. Right? I'm going to stay here with whatever my everything that I can accumulate, even though I know I'm going to lose that eventually. So what can help compel us, not just to the eternal thing that he promises us, but what can help compel us to respond with more faith to follow him down this hard road? Let me tweak a little bit my main idea from suffering precedes joy or death precedes life to this, and this may help us here. Suffering produces joy. Death produces life. See, this is going to help incrementally for us to shift from these are things that we just endure now for the sake of something internal, but now we can start to look at these things like if they produce something now, then I can embrace them for what they can do here in this life, produce here in this life. But this still messes with us. How does suffering produce joy? How does death produce life? Let me just say, we know this, but we just need to be reminded of it. So I want to stir us up by way of reminder by turning to John chapter 15. I'm only going to read the first 2 verses, but here's what it says in John chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. This is Jesus speaking. So Jesus there says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. To follow Jesus, to be a disciple of Jesus, to hear him in Matthew 16 say, anyone who wants to be a disciple of mine, right, is to yield to him as your farmer. And as this vine dresser who prunes, right? And the first thing he tells us in here is he prunes out the bad, the dead stuff that doesn't produce any fruit. And certainly God and Jesus get after that. Not the point of today's sermon, perhaps. But pick up on what he says at the end of that in verse 2. Every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it may bear fruit. The stuff that Jesus is asking us to say no to, less of, self-denial, isn't just the bad stuff in life. He's also asking for the good stuff in life that we need less of, that he wants to prune back. And that's going to feel like suffering, pain, loss. That's what it's going to feel like. But Jesus is the good farmer that knows the good stuff in life that we need less of, so that we can be more productive for his kingdom, for his purposes, for our life. If the vineyard imagery doesn't quite work, you're not an agricultural person, think of a doctor who knows exactly the pain to inflict to bring about healing. Think of a parent who knows exactly what good thing their children need less of in order for them to grow and mature. That's Jesus. He prunes. He knows the stuff in our life that we need less of. And we're going to feel that pain. We're going to feel that suffering. We're going to feel that loss. But he needs to prune those things back, whatever that might be. Good things, right? These could be things like things we need less of, or we need less of. Things like food or money or time or sleep or entertainment. Jesus wants to prune these things back from our inflated sense of need so that we can produce more fruit. Maybe we need to eat less, drink less, spend less money, conserve less time, consume less entertainment, less of these things for the sake of more, for him and for others. Jesus is the best doctor, the best parent, the best farmer of your soul. Trust him. Love him. If I borrow from Kirk Franklin, the gospel singer, allow loving Jesus to be the death of you. May we all die to the life that we think we need, deserve to have, are entitled to get. Because to follow Jesus is to give up ownership of our life. You don't belong to God, or you don't belong to yourself. You belong to God. You are bought with a price, and that is the precious blood of Christ. This may be scary, to lose self-governance, self-autonomy over your own life and entrust yourself to the hands of God. But it is maybe scary, but it is the most secure thing you can do. Now, to try to make this less daunting, perhaps, but to take steps in this direction and not to make it some huge idea that we need to be a missionary going overseas, selling all of our assets, getting rid of all of our money. And yeah, if God's calling you to that, I'm not going to sit here and tell you, no, please do that. I trust him. But we can also consider other steps where we can start to say no to us so that we can say yes to others and to Jesus more. Give up an evening with your family to go sit with somebody, to pray with them and care for them in the midst of their hurting. Give up paying for another entertainment app on your phone and giving that money to somebody who's actually in need. There are lots of small steps we can take to say no more often to getting our own comfort, to getting our own pleasure, to getting our own glory, to getting our own rest, so that we can work and labor for the comfort, the pleasure, the glory, the joy, the rest of others. Start small. And in starting small, Jesus is going to lead you into more, because your no to self is going to produce more joy. Your loss of life will start to produce that life has more meaning when it's lived for others. It's going to start to live out the truth that to give is better than to receive. Follow and learn from Jesus in these small moments, and then he's going to use these moments to train your soul. They're going to be breadcrumbs along the path of life so that when he asks for bigger things, we'll give him more. And we'll discover more joy. And we'll discover more meaningful life. Yes, suffering precedes joy. Death precedes life. Yes, suffering produces joy, and death produces life. Think of a farmer pruning his trees. And here's the last piece for us today as we think about what helps us reflect these things as missionaries. Suffering proclaims joy. Death proclaims life. Consider with me the call in this passage in Matthew to take up your cross. We don't inherently see that and consider others, but here's what I want us to see today. This call to take up your cross at its core is a call to consider others, not yourself. We often hear that phrase. We often consider the phrase of well, that's the cross that I bear. And we think about the burdens we have within ourselves that we need to work through, we need to own, we need to improve, the stuff where we need to grow in our life, the stuff that we may even need to suffer with, because that's kind of who we are, and that's the cross that I bear. That's not what Jesus is asking of you when he says, take up your cross. Consider Jesus himself. Right? Was the cross that Jesus bore because of his own burdens, his own brokenness, his own sin? No. The cross that Jesus bore was the burden of our sin, my sin, your sin, our brokenness, my brokenness, your brokenness, all of those things. That's the cross that Jesus bore. Bearing a cross is fundamentally other-oriented. And so when Jesus says to us, take up your cross, he doesn't say to us, Bear up the weight of your sin. Jesus already dealt with the weight of our sin. That's done with on the cross. That's the beauty of the gospel, is it frees us from the shame and from the weight of our sin. And now we have capacity. And he calls us to be like him, to follow him, to bear up your cross, which is laden with somebody else's burden. To bear your cross is fundamentally about other people's burdens. Perhaps this is why Paul says in Galatians 2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. There's going to be a lot, especially in our time and in our culture. There's going to be a lot of messages, memes, billboards, whatever, preaching a different sermon here to you. And it's going to be calling you to a place of self-care and self-love. It's going to tell you you cannot serve others until you love yourself, until you serve yourself. You can't bear somebody else's burden until you've cared for all of your own burdens. And please don't misunderstand me. I'm not pushing back on all of what is in self-care. It's not all bad. We're not Jesus. So there is place for us to rest, to care, and to be loved. But let's get that from Jesus, not ourself. Because I promise you, as somebody who personally struggles with saying no to my own comforts, my own desires, my own will, I promise you, self-love and self-care, while it may be good in measure, it will deceive you. Self-love is, in part, deceitful. It will always tell you you need more before you can serve. It will always whisper to you, you've given too much. To bear a cross is to bear others' burdens. We proclaim a unique love, a different love, an altogether different love. When we love somebody else, even in the midst of our own pain, when we're hurting, when we feel alone, but we draw near to somebody else, when we give, even when we have needs, when we serve, even when we feel like we need to be served, when we move outwardly, even in the midst of those moments, we proclaim a whole different love than self-love. The call to bear your cross is really a call to a radical community that bears each other's burdens, a community that says, I will say no to my wants so that you can find joy. I will say no to my comforts so that you can find rest. I will say no to my sense of security and wherever I falsely place that so you can find peace. I will say no to my wishes so that you will find hope. I will say yes to my death so that you can find life. That's the call. And we stand as missionaries of Jesus, the one who lived that out perfectly. And he calls us to take up our cross and bear the burdens of others. Die to yourself so that they may find life. Will we be spiritual kidney donors? That's the question. Will we embrace pain, less suffering, so that others can have life? Jesus promises us and he shepherds us. Suffering precedes joy. Denying self for the sake of others will produce joy and purposeful life for you. Death to yourself proclaims a different love to the world around us. That's the road of discipleship. Expect that and embrace that. Let me close with a verse or a passage from 2 Corinthians 4. It's 5 verses. 2 Corinthians 4, verses 7 to 12. This is such a rich chapter, but these verses hone in on the idea that disciples of Jesus are willing to embrace suffering for the sake of others. They're willing to die to self so that others may find life. Here's 2 Corinthians 4, verses 7 to 12. But we, have this treasure in jars of clay. We have the gospel embedded within jars of clay, our own bodies, our own souls, fragile as they are. We have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but we're not crushed. We're perplexed, but we're not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but we are not forsaken. We get struck down, but we are not destroyed. We always carry in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested, proclaimed in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death to self, for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be manifested in our mortal flesh. And this final verse. So death is at work in us, but life in you. We allow death to get to work in us so that others can find life. That's the ministry that Jesus gives all of his disciples. 2 Corinthians 4:1. Therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart. May we continue to say no to ourselves more and more so that we can say yes to Jesus and to others. Love you all.